Thanks, everyone. So my name is Rob Shea, and I am a landscape photographer and an infrared photographer. And I want to share a little bit about what I've learned about infrared photography. When I started infrared photography, there was a challenge to learn. And so what I did is when I would learn something, I would then make a YouTube video and share that. And I thought, I probably got enough ideas for about 10 videos, and then we'll call it a day. But here I am now, and I've made 75 videos on infrared photography that I've shared on YouTube. So lots of information there. So let's buzz through this. I've got a ton of material, but don't worry. We're recording, and we'll have this available, and I'll have links to everything and where you can get more information. Okay, so let's dive in. So what is infrared photography? You may have seen images like this where the trees are white and the skies are blue, or maybe something more colorful with these leaves, orange, yellow, bright, vivid colors. Or maybe you've seen a really high contrast black and white image and wondered how that was created.
Yes.
Or possibly you've seen an image with a really black, dark sky that looks very surreal. Or possibly an image with different casts of reds and violets in the image.
Rob, sorry, can I just interrupt you? We can't see your screen. Can you? I don't think you've shared it.
Okay.
We can see it.
Oh, Leslie, it's fine.
Yeah, so just right click on me and select pin, and then you'll be able to see it full screen.
Pin, okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
All right. So maybe you've seen images like this with a red or a violet cast. These are all basically variations of infrared photography. So what are we going to talk about today? So we'll cover what is infrared photography. We'll talk about the different styles that exist, the equipment that you need, how you can shoot it with an existing camera. You don't actually need that much equipment to get started with infrared photography. And then how to process infrared images, which can be a little bit tricky. And then we'll do a Q&A at the end. So first of all, what is infrared photography? So we'll have to do a little bit of science that's helpful, but don't worry, it won't be too much. So this is the electromagnetic spectrum. It is, of course, not to scale. But within the spectrum, we have a variety of electromagnetic waves, from gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet, visible light that we can see with our eyes, infrared, microwave, and radio. And the main difference between all of these is the length of the wave. They're all basically forms of electromagnetic radiation. So visible light is the part that we can see with our eyes. And this is wavelengths that run from about 400 nanometers to about 750 nanometers. And that distance, that number in nanometers, is the size of the wave. So from peak to peak in a wave. What's interesting is that our eyes don't actually see color. Our eyes see a particular wavelength of light, and then our brains interpret that as color. So if your eye detects a wavelength of 550 nanometers, your brain sees green. So I guess you could say that colors are a pigment of your imagination. For conventional photography, most photographic film is only sensitive to infrared, to visible light, which is the same as our eyes. You may remember in the film era having to use a UV filter to try to block out some of the UV light that would creep into an image and create haze. But predominantly film was designed to capture visible light. Now, digital sensors actually capture from a broader spectrum that runs all the way from 350 nanometers all the way to 1,000 nanometers. So this includes some near ultraviolet light, all of visible light, and a little bit of near infrared light. So in order to prevent UV and IR light from reaching the sensor, which is what we typically want with standard photography, cameras have filters that will block these. So there's a filter that appears in front of the sensor that most people are not aware of, but it's called a hot mirror filter. and it's designed to block specifically infrared light so that we don't get it sort of contaminating an image, if you will, because otherwise the sensor would be able to see that. So we have a few methods of capturing infrared light. So first, we could use film. And so a film, there's special films that will see into the infrared spectrum. And so we would be able to capture both visible light and infrared light. Secondly, with digital cameras, we can use a filter to block visible light. So for example, a Hoya R72 filter. And by blocking visible light more than we're blocking infrared, we're actually allowing more infrared to get through, because no blocking is really 100%. So it's a matter of blocking more than the other. This sort of battle of exposures results in more infrared light getting in than visible light. So this is one way that we can capture this. The final method that we use for capturing is to convert a digital camera by removing that hot mirror. When we remove the hot mirror, now the camera gives you access to the entire spectrum. So the sensor can now see all of these. You could replace that hot mirror with a specific filter that's used for infrared, or you could replace it with no filter at all, allowing your camera to be a full spectrum camera and see the entire range of light that the sensor can now read. So let's talk about the various styles of infrared photography, because there's many styles. There's many combinations of infrared light, visible light, ultraviolet light. Collectively, I tend to talk about these as infrared, but because of that's the broad category. But again, sometimes we're collecting some visible light, and sometimes we're even capturing ultraviolet light. But they use similar techniques and similar equipment, so that's why we talk about them together. So the first style to talk about is traditional infrared. So this is a filter that will block most visible light except for a sliver of light at the red end of the spectrum, and then everything up into near infrared. So this is just a little bit of visible light and more infrared light. This is done typically with a 720 nanometer filter. So this in a traditional infrared image, the plants that you would see, so trees and grass, they'll reflect infrared light since infrared light is not used in photosynthesis. So as a result, instead of plants absorbing it, much like they do visible light, they reflect it all, and so it becomes very bright. And this combination of infrared light plus some visible light creates very colorful foliage, and so that's what you see in many of these images. Now, with a traditional infrared, you're just getting a sliver of that visible light, so just a little bit of color. It's not very saturated. But we do get blue skies after we've done a little bit of tricks, which we'll talk about later. Monochrome infrared is basically like monochrome visible. So it's basically, you could take a variety of infrared light combined with a variety of visible light. There's a whole number of ways that you could produce monochrome infrared images. Some that are just infrared, but some that are a combination. So these could be shot as JPEG, or you could convert an image to monochrome when you're processing. Deep infrared is basically what we mean when we say infrared only. So in a deep infrared image, we're only capturing infrared light. We're not capturing any visible light at all. So we're using a filter from about 750 to 950 nanometers. Most commonly, these filters would be like an 830 or an 850 nanometer high-pass filter. So the deep infrared, typically because there's no color in these images, because our eyes, as we said earlier, they're trained to convert visible light wavelengths into colors, but because our eyes can't see infrared, they have no frame of reference to convert that to a color. So there is no color really in infrared. So if we're capturing only infrared light, you're basically going to capture a monochrome image. Frequently, these are converted to black and white or some maybe sepia tone or some variation. But a deep infrared image only contains infrared light. It's capturing no visible light at all. So what's interesting about deep infrared is not only could you get very black skies, but you could get really black, almost inky black water, which can be really stark. So if you like shooting water, this can be really interesting. And then you're going to get this white foliage as well. So before we talk about the other styles, let's talk a little bit about a camera conversion, because a camera conversion is required for the other styles. So in that converted camera, you're going to take that hot mirror that's within your camera, which blocks IR light, and we'll remove that and replace it with a different filter, maybe a infrared high pass filter or full spectrum, that allows you to capture these other types of styles. Typically, a conversion of a camera costs about $275 US. This conversion will void the warranty, and it's essentially permanent. So it's definitely something that gives people pause when they think about doing this. I've done it many times and been very happy with the results. So the upcoming styles all require a camera conversion, and I'll summarize this at the end as well. So a style of infrared that we call color infrared captures a little bit more visible light than just that sliver of red. It actually captures all of red and orange light. So filters could range from as low as 470 to as high as 665 nanometers, capturing a variety of light. This will produce different amounts of color saturation. The less visible light that you capture, the less color saturation. The more visible light that you capture, the more color saturation will be available in your image natively before you apply any post-processing. So after, excuse me, after we do post-processing, one of the things that we do is we'll typically swap what we could call a color swap, where we're taking the reds and blues and swapping those, and this is what gives us the blue skies and colorful foliage. So skies will end up being a blue or a teal, and then the trees and the grass will be a yellow or an orange or a red color. So there's a lot of creative options when it comes to color infrared. There's a lot of filters that give you those varieties of saturation. Most of the infrared that I've shot is with a 590 nanometer filter, so it's capturing the orange, red, infrared, and I find that this gives me a lot of flexibility, lots of color, lots of blue skies, lots of opportunity. If you go lower to, say, a 550 nanometer filter, which is sometimes called an orange filter because the filter itself looks orange, not necessarily the resulting image, this is actually capturing yellows as well. So it's really expanding the amount of visible light that's captured, and these images shot with a orange filter produce really vivid saturated colors. So if you're really into color saturation, then an orange 550 nanometer filter is the way to go. The next style is full spectrum. So this is where we're capturing all of the light. So we're capturing infrared light, all visible light, and ultraviolet light. This also requires a converted camera. The hot mirror is removed and then replaced with a clear filter. So now the sensor can see all of these forms of light. The resulting images tend to have very red and violet casts because your camera is going to interpret the infrared as red, and it's going to interpret the ultraviolet as violet. And so that will tend to create a particular cast in those styles of images. The next style is something that we call chrome. And so what chrome is it's unique because instead of your typical high pass filter where we're just capturing values of wavelengths above a certain amount, we're actually capturing two different ranges. So one range is, and this is intended to sort of mirror the look of Kodak Aerochrome film that was commonly available. And in that film, the colors were remapped. So reds became green, infrared became red, and you had this really interesting red or pink foliage. So with digital cameras, the chrome uses this multipass style, and in a multipass we have the reds and the infrared, which are captured in one pass, and then in addition to that we have the blue that's captured in a second pass. What's interesting about this is that because of this methodology, we don't have to do a color swap in post-production. All of these images come out kind of as is with this look and style. So if you're big on, if you're really interested in shooting infrared, but you're not a big fan of spending time editing infrared, then Chrome could be a really good solution for you. This, of course, also requires a camera conversion. Ultraviolet ultraviolet style is another way to capture light. This, again, is only going to be ultraviolet light with no visible light. This will require a full spectrum camera, and you'll need a UV low pass or band pass filter. And this is important because this is different than your typical UV filter, which of course is blocking UV light. A UV band pass filter is allowing UV light and blocking visible light. What's really interesting about ultraviolet is it brings out a lot of interesting skin pigmentation on individuals, and it's also very popular with flowers because the pigmentation that appears in flowers can be dramatically different than what you see to the visible eye. So ultraviolet is very popular with flower photography as well. So those are the different styles we have of infrared. Let's talk about the equipment that's required to shoot infrared. So we have a couple options when it comes to infrared. Much like other forms of photography, we can shoot on film or we can shoot in digital. I'll briefly discuss film and I'll spend more time on digital because digital is more popular these days. So back in the film era, one of the most popular films for capturing infrared was Kodak Aerochrome, but unfortunately it's no longer manufactured. It was actually discontinued in 2009. It's still available though on eBay if you'd like to pony up about $300 a roll. So very pricey to get your hands on some Aerochrome. There's been some other small batch runs of infrared films, color infrared films, but none of them have lasted and they've all been discontinued. So if you like the style that's produced by Aerochrome, then converting a camera to full spectrum and using a chrome style filter is definitely the way to go. But if you'd still like to shoot infrared film, then black and white films are still available. So for example, the Rollei Infrared 400 is the probably the most readily available of the black and white infrared films. This film will capture both visible and infrared light. So without a filter, the results will look like a typical black and white image. But if you pair this with a 720 nanometer filter, such as the Hoya R72, that will block most of the visible light, resulting in a mostly infrared image. Now, because of the differences in exposure from that filter, you're actually going to have to increase the exposure by 4 to 5 stops when using this filter. So you might have to do some bracketing and get a bit tricky. You're getting down into the, ISO 612 range, 25, somewhere down in there. So getting the exposure right is a little bit tricky. So when we talk about digital, sort of broadly speaking, we really have two options when it comes to shooting infrared digitally. One is with unconverted cameras. And when I say unconverted, I mean probably the camera you already have, where there's no change that's been made to it. What's nice about unconverted is that you can simply add a filter, simply add something like a Hoya R72 filter, and then you can shoot a variety of styles. You can shoot deep infrared, you can shoot traditional infrared, you can do monochrome, and it's relatively affordable. So because all you need is that additional filter paired with the existing equipment you have. If you really get into infrared and want to think about converting a camera, now the options really open up. You can use all of those styles, plus you can add color, chrome, full spectrum, UV. You've got the whole world of that is available to you. You can shoot a converted camera without a filter or with filters. There's a whole combination of things. So for example, I could convert a camera directly to a 590 nanometer filter and then just shoot it without, that internally, and then just shoot without filters, which I've done that. Or I could convert a camera to full spectrum and then add an external 590 nanometer filter. So either of those options are available. The downside is that this is going to cost more. You'll have to pay for a conversion, and then you may have to pay for additional external filters as well. So let's talk about each a little bit, to the differences. So we'll start with unconverted, and then we'll cover converted. So we'll talk for each. We'll talk about the equipment you need, what are the pros and cons, and then how to shoot and edit. So with unconverted, as I mentioned, you can use the camera that you have. So it will work with nearly any DSLR or mirrorless digital camera. With a mirrorless camera, you can pretty much use as is. With a DSLR, the only limitation is you want to stick to live view. And the reason is that focusing, the focus distance is different between visible light and infrared light. And the mirror that reflects up to a viewfinder, an optical viewfinder, it slices off a little bit of that light to do focusing, and that's calibrated for visible light. It will not work with infrared. You'll end up with results that are out of focus. But if you use the live view on DSLR and set the focus directly with that methodology, then you'll be able to focus accurately. You can focus manually. I wouldn't trust the focus markings because they won't make sense anymore. In infrared light, you could use focus assist to zoom in, or you can use focus peaking, which I find to be really helpful when trying to focus in infrared. So you'll need that external filter to block out most of the visible light. So a 720 nanometer infrared high pass filter. So something like a Hoya R72. There's standard IR filters from Colarivision, LifePixel, a Tiffin 89. Any of these work. What I would say though is steer clear of budget infrared filters with unconverted cameras. I have lost track of the number of people who send me images saying, why doesn't my filter work? And I open it up and I can clearly see that the image is contaminated with way too much visible light. The filter that they bought inexpensively is made rather cheaply and doesn't work well. Sometimes those cheap filters can work okay with a converted camera, but I would definitely avoid cheap filters if you're going to shoot unconverted. The investment here is minimal. Just do yourself a favor and get a Hoya R72. Then you may need to consider the size of that filter and the different lenses that you have. So you may need to consider having step-up rings to account for that. So if you don't want to have more than one filter. Now, one of the pitfalls that we have for infrared is working with lenses. And so some lenses will produce hotspots. So you can see in the image here, on the middle of that tree, there's like an overexposed spot that we call a hotspot. Sometimes it's an exposure difference. Sometimes there's a little color temperature difference. But the problem is that about half of all lenses will produce hotspots. There's no absolute guarantee of what will or won't. And in fact, the camera manufacturers, because infrared's a small market, they don't publish typically whether lenses support infrared or not. And so you have to do the research. So I've got a link that you can use to do some research on your lenses and figure out if they're supported or not. And I've got a variety of research that I've done on Fujifilm that I shoot, and I point to a variety of other resources for other people who've tested. And so it's really the community that is just testing a lens and posting the results, and we share so that we can figure out what is a good lens and what is a bad lens for infrared. In general, primes tend to be better than zooms. They have fewer hotspots. Vintage lenses tend to be better than modern lenses, and this is because of the coatings that are used. There's coatings on modern lenses used to correct for chromatic aberrations, and these actually can cause hotspots. And then wider apertures will tend to cause either fewer or no hotspots compared to the narrow apertures, the high f-stop numbers, which can produce more hotspots. So lenses is a tricky thing that you need to be aware of if you're going to be shooting in infrared. Now, because of that filter that you're putting in front of the camera, you're going to have long exposures. So you're going to need a tripod and probably some kind of trigger. So it could be a cable release or a remote trigger on your phone app, or a self-timer within the camera. But you'll want to be able to have that camera in a sturdy place and be able to trigger it without moving the camera because of the long exposure times that you'll have with an unconverted camera. So what are the benefits of shooting unconverted? Well, it's really easy to get started. It's affordable. I mean, it is still photography, so there's a caveat there. Relatively affordable. There's no camera conversion cost, and in all likelihood, all you may need is a single lens filter, maybe another lens depending on what lenses you have. There's no permanent changes to your camera, so if you try it and you don't like it, no harm, no foul. Just resell that filter that you bought, and you've got a variety of shooting styles from the traditional infrared, deep infrared, that infrared only, monochrome, so lots of options. This is really great for shooting long exposures because the filter kind of acts as a normal neutral density filter. So if you like shooting long exposures with water or clouds, you're going to get that kind of right out of the box with this filter, and so that could lend itself to that. You can shoot really great images with an unconverted camera. I've shot many that I've been extremely pleased with. So definitely a great way to get started before you've made too much of an investment. On the negative side of an unconverted camera, you are going to have those long exposures, so you're probably going to need a tripod and some kind of a trigger. You may have to deal with motion blur for your subjects, so depending, if it's a windy day or if your subjects are moving, that's something to keep in mind, unless that's an effect you're looking for, of course. And there are some styles of infrared that you will not be able to shoot, so you won't be able to shoot color infrared, just that traditional with just the muted colors. You won't be able to shoot things like chrome, full spectrum, or ultraviolet with an unconverted camera. So let's talk a little bit about shooting and what it takes to shoot infrared. We'll cover that, but I also want to talk about shooting infrared with a converted camera as well, so that we have some context to compare the two. So let's talk about a converted camera, then we'll go back to shooting. So with a converted camera, you're going to need to convert a camera. So you could do it yourself, you could pay to have it done, but you'll need to have that camera modified. Some things become optional. You probably don't need a tripod now because the shutter times are now going to be comparable to visible light photography. And you're probably shooting in broad daylight a lot. So you don't need a tripod, you don't need a trigger. You may or may not need lens filters or step-up rings depending on what your camera was converted to. Those are all optional. So for example, if I took a camera and converted it to a 590 nanometer filter or a 720 nanometer filter, I could just go out and start shooting. Don't need tripods, filters, anything else. I can go out and shoot infrared. Very easy to do. So again, even with a converted camera, you're still going to have the lens issue. There still is a possibility for hotspots because, again, this is about the light, not about the sensor. And so be aware that some lenses will perform better with infrared than other lenses. So you definitely have to do your research. I always tell people, don't go on any big trips, to some fancy parks and whatnot before you've tested your equipment to make sure that you're going to be happy with the results, that you've got the right lens. So when it comes to converting a camera, you've got a variety of options. You can go to a professional service to have that done. And so I've got a couple services listed here. I've got more services listed on my website. They're available all over the world. I know that this can be more challenging in some countries, depending on access to some of these conversions and shipping costs. So that's definitely a factor that some people have to contend with. You can also do it yourself if you feel comfortable with electronic equipment. There are guides available from LifePixel that will show you how to disassemble a camera, remove the filter, and then replace it with another filter. Some of these might require some soldering, but some don't. I'm actually thinking about converting a camera that doesn't require soldering, just some tiny screws that I have to deal with and the whole disassembly and reassembly. So I'm thinking about doing that myself. But a lot of people would say you need a clean room, you need all the right equipment, and so these are definitely considerations. If you have an expensive camera, it may be worth having a professional to do the conversion. So what are some of the pros of using a converted camera? Well, you get access to all the styles available. That's maybe a blessing and a curse, kind of analysis paralysis, too many options, but you do have all of those available to you. You can use any kind of an external filter if you go full spectrum, so that gives you even more flexibility. You could add a variety of filters depending on what you're shooting. Because the exposures are much shorter, the times, you can shoot handheld for just about anything. I rarely, if ever, use a tripod when shooting with a converted camera. There's just no need. I'm in the daylight, my exposure times are in the 500th of a second, 1000th of a second. Just don't have a need for a tripod. And of course, you can still shoot great images, really, with either method, with converted or unconverted. If you make an investment, there's not one that's better than the other. They're just different. So what are some of the negatives of a converted camera? Well, you have to actually do the conversion. It's kind of a permanent change. I mean, you could do it again, but you'll have to pay that same amount of money to have it done again. So I tend to think of it as a permanent change. You have to commit to it. I would encourage people to convert a camera in the same family of a camera that they have, so that they don't have like 2 sets of lenses and 2 sets of batteries and 2 sets of everything. I've got a video on YouTube that talks about picking a camera to convert, but I like staying in the same ecosystem so that you can share your equipment and you're not having to double up on a lot of things. This will void the warranty, and there is going to be a cost to it. So it's definitely something to consider. I remember the first time I converted a camera, boy, was I like really nervous about the whole thing. Like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I'm ruining this expensive piece of gear. But it wasn't that bad. I used a reliable source, and that was years ago, and I still use that camera to this day. I'm very, very happy with that, and I've converted many cameras since that time frame. So it's a relatively known procedure these days. Again, if you know what you're doing or use a trusted source. So now, with a converted camera, if you want a long exposure, you actually have to use an ND filter to get that, and so you can get those ND filters. There are ND filters that are specially made to ensure that they have the same blocking power in infrared light. So that's something to be aware of. Maybe some visible light ND filters don't have the same blocking power. And if you've got full spectrum, you can now shoot any style imaginable, which could be costly with buying all of those filters. And gear acquisition syndrome is a thing. It's real, and it's probably worse in infrared because there are just so many options available. And if you want to try all the options, that can get a bit pricey. So just definitely something to be aware of. Okay, so let's talk about shooting infrared with an existing camera, so an unconverted camera. What does this look like? What does this process look like? It's really not that complicated. When you're shooting infrared, when you get started, it's best to shoot in the midday sun. Infrared likes full blast midday sun, the kind that you've been taught not to shoot photography in. It's perfect for infrared. Cloudy and shaded conditions will give you less contrast, and especially closer to the golden hour, which again is great for visible light, but not so good for infrared. These are guidelines. Once you get into it, you can break all of these rules, but it's definitely good to follow them when you first get started. So you're going to need a DSLR or mirrorless camera. For this example, I used a Fujifilm X-T2, which is a 6-year-old crop sensor camera. I paired that with a Fujinon 14mm lens, which is one of my favorite lenses, and it doesn't have hot spots, and so it's really great. Vintage lenses are also great. I've used many vintage lenses as well. I have a tripod. I have a cable release. This is admittedly totally unnecessary. It just makes me look cool as I get to do the plunger thing. But you're just as good with the self-timer in the camera as well. And then, of course, I have this Hoya R72 filter. So I set up the camera and the tripod, and I compose my shot before I put the filter on. I need to be able to see what I'm doing. It's going to get a little bit harder to see on your viewfinder once you put that filter on. So I want to compose my shot first. So what about settings? You want to use the lowest ISO. This shouldn't be a problem. You've got broad daylight, a lot of light coming in, and so you should be able to use, in this case, 200, could be 50 or 100 for you, whatever the case may be. Stick to a low ISO. Your shutter speed is probably automatic or aperture priority. This is the part that's going to vary depending on your exposure. So I tend to set this to automatic and manually control, ISO and aperture. You can also go full manual if you're comfortable with your histogram as well. For the aperture, I recommend that people who are new to infrared use one stop lower, or a lower number, than you typically use for landscape. And the reason is that diffraction is much more pronounced in infrared than it is at visible light. In fact, the amount of diffraction going from, say, f11 to 5.6 doubles any two stops and the amount of diffraction doubles. So diffraction will creep in much sooner. So typically, if you don't know what that value is, I would say avoid the top 3 highest f-stop numbers on your lens and start there. So in this case, if it was f22, I would avoid 22, 16, 11, and then I would use f8 or lower. So diffraction is can be definitely problematic with infrared, so it's something to be aware of for your system. I've got a complete video on the impact of diffraction on infrared. So after you've composed your shot and adjusted your settings, now you can add an infrared filter to the lens. And with the filter on, the image is going to be very red, like you see on the left here. This is normal. This is perfectly normal. On the right is what this image will look like after processing. So there's going to have to be some processing to get to this step. So let's talk a little bit about white balance. White balance is super tricky in infrared, and I'll kind of show you some stuff, but it's the question I get the most comments on. I've made 2 full videos on white balance, and I cover white balance in nearly every video that I do because people tend to get stuck on it a lot. So don't feel alone if you get stuck in white balance. This is a really common pitfall that people have. So one of the things that you'll want to do is shoot in RAW. The benefit of shooting in RAW is that you'll have full control of the white balance when editing. So you can do a custom white balance when you're shooting, but it's not required. RAW gives you a lot of flexibility to do either one or the other or both. And you're really going to need that flexibility when shooting in infrared. It just, I know a lot of people like to white balance, especially some landscape photographers really like to white balance when they're shooting, and that's fine. But the important part is that you're shooting in RAW so you can white balance while you're editing. When it comes to focus, again, I like to manually focus when I'm using an unconverted camera, live view. I've found that using focus peaking, especially if you have the option to set your focus peaking to blue, it stands out against the red image, and it'll really make it easy to see what is in focus. So in this particular case, you can see these trees are going to be in focus because they all have that blue halo around them. That's the focus peaking at work. You do not want to use the optical viewfinder on a DSLR because, again, the focus will be wrong. So some sort of live view or a digital viewfinder, manual focus, zoom in, focus peaking, that's really what you want when it comes to focus, to make sure that you've locked it in. So then you take the shot. So the shot, again, is going to look very red in camera, but that's totally normal. We'll cover that in the processing. So let's talk about how we process infrared images. So I will cover this process in Photoshop, but I have many videos on YouTube that address how to process in Lightroom. I've covered about 10 different RAW editors, so a lot of coverage for all of those. But to get started here, we'll keep it to Photoshop. So this is the whole process, and it can be very challenging for some people, but it really doesn't have to be. It's really straightforward. So there's a one-step process of creating a profile. This profile is going to shift the color temperature to allow us to get a good white balance. So that's the first step. Then we apply that profile. Now we can actually set a good white balance in our editor. If we want, we can swap colors to make those skies blue and then edit to taste. So once you get past these first couple steps, everything's pretty straightforward. And it becomes a lot like editing typical visible light images. So how do we get this DNG color profile or DCP file? Well, I started a project last year to collect RAW files from the community who would send me these, and then I collect these and create these profiles and offer them in a download called the Infrared Profile Pack. I now have over 200 cameras that are supported. This makes it super easy. Just download the pack and look for your camera. If your camera's not supported, send me a RAW file and I'll add it to the pack. Or if you like to do it yourself, you can create your own DNG files using Lightroom Classic or the Adobe DNG Converter, and then you can use the Adobe DNG Profile Editor to create your own profiles. Some people may want to bake some more contrast in or make a couple other tweaks in their profile. That's perfectly reasonable to do that there as well. But again, this is a one-time process. Once you have these profiles, you won't need to recreate them for every image or every shoot. So when you first open your image, in Camera Raw, it's going to be very red, just like it was in the camera. When you try to set a custom white balance, in this case, I'll try to white balance on the granite, you'll notice that the color temperature value is pegged at 2000. It can't go any lower, but we actually need it to go lower. This is what we need that profile for. With some images, it may be the other way. It may be pegged at 50,000. So these profiles help us to adjust this slider so we can get more range. So that's where the profiles come in. So going into the profile browser up here, if we click that, we can see all of the profiles that are available. So in this section, if you've created a DCP file, it'll appear in profiles under that category. You can look for it there. Or if you've made it a favorite like I have here, it'll show up under favorites. And you can select your custom profile. Now, when you first select a profile, it may make the colors really, really wonky. And that's okay. We still need to select the profile and then click OK. So now that we are back to the basic panel, now we can set a white balance. So what we'll do is we'll use this eyedropper value, the picker, the white balance picker, a selector, and we will pick a spot on the granite, which in this case I know is a neutral element. So it's white, it's gray, it doesn't have a lot of color in it. That's what we want to find when we're white balancing, is very much like visible light. Try to find something neutral. In this image, I just happen to have a 3,000 foot gray card right in front of me, so I can click on that. So once I've done that, and now with the custom profile, I can set a white balance that falls within the range of the slider. So now that means because it's within the range, I know I have a good value. You'll see that the sky is kind of a soft gold yellow, and the trees and the granite are white, maybe a hint of blue there. And this is what we would expect at this point. So now I can make any other adjustments that I want in Camera Raw. So I might want to add some contrast, clarity, curves, dehaze, any other things that I want to do. And then after I make these adjustments, then I can click the Open Object button to open this as a smart object. So if you're working in Photoshop, it really helps to open it as a smart object. If you just open it, then it'll be a flat image, and you'll lose the ability to come back into Camera Raw. But if I open it as a smart object, then I can come back into Camera Raw and tweak these settings later on, which is really useful. So once I've got this open, now I want to swap my colors. So in Photoshop, I'm going to come to the Layers panel. And then if you don't see layers, you can get to it through the Windows drop down and then open layers that way. At the bottom of the Layers panel is the ability to open these adjustment layer, the adjustment layer icon, it's a little circle. And then from there, you can pick Channel Mixer to open the Channel Mixer. That's what we're going to use to swap the colors. So once I have the Channel Mixer open, I can look in the properties, and this is where I want to make my adjustments. So I want to go to the output channel that is red, and I want to make a change here. I want to set the red, which is normally 100%, to 0. And then I want to set the blue, which is normally 0, to 100%. So now anything that was red in the image is now blue. So now I'm going to do the same thing to the blue output channel. I'm going to take everything in the blue output channel that was red, previously 0, now it's 100%. And the blue, which was previously 100%, is now 0%. This will take anything that was blue in the image and convert it to red. So this is how we get our color swap. So in addition, you could do this manually, of course, but I've got a set of Photoshop actions that are available for free on my website, and you could use these to do this quickly. So I've got a whole bunch of actions that allow you to very quickly apply and try different looks and styles to make this process much easier. So after swapping the red and blue channels, now the colors are very different. And that pretty much covers the basic steps for creating an infrared image. From here, you can then double-click the image to return to Camera Raw and make additional adjustments. Or you could make other changes you want in Photoshop. So one of the things that I typically do is add a hue saturation adjustment layer and tweak the colors a little bit. So here's an example of having done that with a hue saturation adjustment layer. I've desaturated some of the foliage a little bit, changed the color of the sky. Maybe I want to get the sky to be a little bit more blue, maybe a little bit more natural from, sometimes it has a bit of a teal look that you want to adjust. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So Another thing that's available is, in addition to working in Photoshop and using the actions there, you might also want to do this right in Lightroom. And that was one thing that I worked on for a long time. So I created some profiles that would allow me to make these color changes directly in Lightroom, because the problem with going to Photoshop is that, first of all, do I want to take every photo on my shoot to Photoshop and back? That's a lot of work. That really slows down my workflow. Plus, once I've done that, now I've created an extra TIFF or PSD file that now has to come back. I've doubled the size of my files. That seems crazy. So what this does, these profiles do, is they basically take those color shifting profiles that we talked about earlier, those DCP files, and they combine them with a LUT, and then allow us to get these effects right in Lightroom. So I've got instructions on my website. You can create these yourself, or you can order them if you like, whatever works for you. I find this to be a super convenient way. It's really sped up my workflow for processing color infrared images within Lightroom. So what are your next steps? Go grab yourself an infrared lens filter and go out and start shooting. One of the things I wanted to mention briefly is I actually have a new book coming out. And so this is going to be kind of what you saw today, but in a lot more detail. So covering everything that I know about infrared photography, I've put into this book. So this should be out soon, coming out this summer. And covers everything from what infrared is, all the equipment for all the different permutations, everything you need about shooting, developing, so a ton of information here. So I'm really excited about this. I put a lot of time into preparing this, and it's going to be out soon. So I'm really excited about that. You can get information at infraredbook.com. Okay, so that's it. So I've got some links here to help you get more information. The book, of course, there's a ton of videos, information about, like I said, converting cameras, what to pick, how to process, shoot and process unconverted, converted. I've got details in my blog, various articles, information about lenses, coaching, and then all the downloads. So profiles for your camera, actions for Photoshop, LUTs if you want to apply infrared techniques into video, all kinds of stuff, and then some of the conversion companies if you're interested in getting a camera converted. Okay. So that's what I have for today. So now I'd like to turn it over to you all and have you see if you have any questions to ask.
Thanks, Rob. I've been doing this for a while and I learned a few things there too.
Excellent.
I wanted to ask you, when you focus through like a Hoyer filter on an unconverted camera, with live view, you're focusing through that filter already as well. So you put the filter on and then focus through it.
Yes. So you want to, if you have an unconverted camera, what you want to do is compose your shot first, because it's easier to see your composition and the details, then put the filter on, then do the focusing. It's really important that you focus with the filter on, because that focus distance will be different. It changes. So, for example, if you would normally focus to infinity, maybe you're focusing to 15 feet or 10 feet. So it can be substantial enough that an image will be out of focus. So it's definitely important to focus after you put that filter on. I'm going to look through, see if there's any questions in the comments that came up here.
Thank
Rob,
you.
Could I ask a question? Leslie,
of course.
here. Are there certain things that will look better when shot in infrared than other things, like foliage is better than buildings, etc.? What are the prime subjects that you would want to photograph in infrared?
Sure. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to drag this over here so I can get this all on my screen here. Okay. So I have identified, I've kind of come up with something in my head that I use for managing these images. And what they are is 3 different subjects that I call them. So subject number 1 is the sky, or clouds and sky. So that tends to be a really interesting subject in infrared. I've shot some really interesting high contrast clouds. They can look really interesting. You could do interesting things with the color of the sky. So clouds and sky is one. Number two is foliage. So this could be any greenery that's going to reflect light. So it could be grass, it could be trees, you know, a whole variety of organic material that would reflect light. And then the third subject is what I would call neutrals. So these are things that are not going to reflect any color. So these could be buildings or roads or sidewalks, paved paths. And so to me, when I'm thinking about an infrared image, I'm thinking about do I have those three elements? And how will they form the composition? Because the composition will be different than a visible light where you have a ton of color that's going on. The amount of color is going to be limited. The contrast is going to be different. So it's going to be about those three subjects and how you use them in combination with each other. Sometimes you'll have all three, sometimes you'll only have two. But it helps me to think of them that way because, for example, if you might come across a scene with a lot of greenery and you think that, oh, this is very beautiful, but if you shoot it in infrared, you might find that it's just all one solid color. And it's like a field of grass almost. There's no texture, there's no pattern, there's no interest there. And so sometimes shooting greenery alone is not enough. You have to combine it with either neutrals or the sky to create an interesting composition.
Yeah. And I think that's obviously where the skill comes in and the experience is to know what looks good and what to photograph.
Definitely. It's one of those things where you just have to get out and shoot, and it takes time to learn. And it's like any kind of photography. You got to go take a bunch of bad photos before you're going to be able to take a good one. A whole bunch of bad photos.
There's a comment or message from Kumar asking, saying, thanks for the excellent talk. Any tips on shooting dawn and dusk using full converted with 590?
Sure. So a couple things to keep in mind. The amount of light, this is not really visible to your eye so much because our brains adapt for it, but the amount of light entering the amount of infrared light that is available at dawn and dusk drops off dramatically. And so what that results in is a much longer exposure. It will also mean less contrast. So images around the dawn and dusk with, say, a 590, you'll find that everything becomes flatter with the lack of contrast. And what I have to do is definitely crank up the contrast and be aware of the impact that's going to have. And frequently, I'm not saying you can't shoot at dawn and dusk with a 590, and I know some people like to, it's one of those breaking the rules things. If you can figure out how to break the rule, it works well. But in general, it's going to really depend on your subject. Will your subject have a lot of contrast to compensate for what's happening with the light? Will you have a lot of shadows or not? And so the other thing that's going to happen when you have those conditions, so it could be dawn dusk, it could be overcast or in the shade, is that the color balance will shift dramatically. The shifts of color balance are even more dramatic in infrared than I think they are in visible light. And so you might have to use a different profile to accommodate for that. So for example, for my camera, if I'm shooting a 590 under those not direct sunlight conditions, then what I'll find is that I typically need to use the kind of profile that I would use with a different filter, like a 720, because the difference is so dramatic. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. It's going to be a little harder, and there's going to be a lot less contrast. It's going to be a little trickier to get results you're happy with.
I see Hendrik's got his hand up. Hendrik, do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was just struggling to unmute this side. Now, you do much more infrared, but obviously it looks like you've played on the ultraviolet side as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the limitations that you have on the ultraviolet side with regards to speed and things like reflectors, how much of your ultraviolet do you actually reflect with things like aluminium, etc.? Because if you take photographs of people and flowers, sometimes you need a smaller aperture, sometimes you need a faster speed. So does it actually work that well, or what's the limitations for it?
So I will say that ultraviolet is much more challenging than infrared. So like ultraviolet only is much more challenging than infrared only. You need the range of light you're capturing is only from about 350 to 400 nanometers. So that's very limiting. The amount of exposure that you're going to get is much lower, so you're going to need longer exposure times. In fact, the one example that I showed you of the face, that was probably a very high ISO to accommodate for to be able to get my shutter speed down and have it be handheld. Now, if you're shooting, say, flowers on a tripod or something, you may have more flexibility in your shutter time. But if you're shooting people, it can be very challenging because the amount of light you need is so high compared to visible light or infrared. So that's probably the biggest challenge. I haven't done a lot with infrared. I'm sorry, with reflections in ultraviolet, or I know that there are flashes you can get to augment this as well. That'll output ultraviolet light. That's something that I want to do more testing of in the future. Is learning about using artificial light sources as well to see what how that can augment ultraviolet. Ultraviolet is very interesting, but it's also very challenging. And also the other challenge with ultraviolet is that unlike infrared, where you have to worry about hotspots, you have a lens issue, but it's different, and that is the amount of transmission of the ultraviolet light. A lot of lenses will naturally block more ultraviolet light, and so you have to find lenses that are better at transmitting it. Otherwise, they get very dark. So that becomes a challenge as well.
Okay, so my thinking outside of the box with macro work might not work all that easy and that well at the end of the day.
There's I think it's going to be about you know, in addition to the full spectrum camera and the UV bandpass filter, you're going to have to do a lot of research on lenses. There's a forum on the web called ultravioletphotography.com, which has got a collection of people who do nothing but ultraviolet, not even infrared, and that's a great resource for finding lenses that are good for ultraviolet. I've just dabbled up to this point.
Thank you very much. This is a stunning tool.
Thank you.
Someone also asked, can you comment on the quality differences between clip-on filters versus filter on the front of the lens?
So the clip-on meaning
I
like
presume it's the
like
one,
like inside?
Yeah, the sensor, between the lens and the camera.
Yeah. So like like a flange style clip-in filter. Yeah. From what I've seen, those because of the position of where they are in the light path, it allows them to be smaller. I haven't seen too many quality issues with them. You're going to get a little bit of a quality variation between brands, and that's sort of normal. Most of the clip-in filters that I've seen tend to come from reputable providers. So like say, you know, Kalari Vision or STC Optics. So they tend to be pretty good quality, but there will be variations between them. So for example, if I hold up my STC Optics clip-in filter 720 and I hold that next to a R72 Hoya external filter, the Hoya is much darker. It's many stops darker. It's better at blocking visible light. And I think that those internal filters let in a little bit more visible light, maybe a few stops worth. Now, if you have a converted camera, I've shot with it many times. It's fine. It looks great. I don't notice. Unconverted, it probably would not work as well. So you have to be more, when you're working with an unconverted camera, the quality of the filter is more important. When you're working with a converted camera, you have a little bit more flexibility with the quality. And so a little bit of variation between an STC Optics and a Hoya doesn't bother me that much.
Liz, can you see if anybody else has questions?
I have some questions that came up from the live stream, so I'll take a look at those.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. So somebody asked about tips for infrared filters for iPhones. I actually did a whole video on YouTube for this, and you can buy a clip that will clip over your, put like a 37 millimeter filter over your iPhone camera. And it actually works pretty well. You got to worry about light leaks. That can be kind of challenging. And you're going to have some hot spots with the iPhone cameras, but they're actually pretty minor and easily to correct. So I've got a whole video on that. So check that out if you're interested in IR with an iPhone. Let's see.
We can ditch all the cameras now. And just
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The quality is still not going to be that great.
Yeah.
Let's see. More talk about iPhones. The profile, somebody mentioned this in the chat, so I'll say it here, is that the use of profiles to adjust color temperature is really important for Adobe editors and a couple other editors that can use those. But some editors have a broad enough range that they don't need it. So for example, something like On1 or Affinity Photo, or some of the open source editors like Darktable or Raw Therapy, those can actually do the full color temperature adjustment without a need for a special profile. So the profiles, I talk about the profiles because they're needed for Adobe products, and the Adobe products tend to be the most popular, but they're not the only solution around. There's other editors that you can use, and some people may prefer those other ones better. Some people get really worked up about the subscription model, which I understand. And so there's a lot of different editors that are available.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes. Okay, any more questions?
I don't see anyone with their hands up,
Okay, okay.
and none from
Well,
our side. Yeah.
It just remains for me to say that I'm just so impressed with this sort of community type of sort of feeling, and with infrared, and how that, if you ask questions, or if you look for blogs or YouTube videos, they're all there, and one is just able to access so much information that one couldn't maybe 10 years ago. So
right.
And you are just amazingly generous with all your information that you put out there. And yes, if anybody wants to know more about ordering and converting cameras, speak to me, because I've done it. And if you want to know about where you can get clip-in filters or all those sort of things, I have done it here from South Africa. It's worked pretty well. So I can give you that information. But
Yep,
Rob,
and you
so
you can always reach out to me as well.
Yes,
You can connect with me through YouTube comments on my videos, or on Instagram. You can find me on Instagram at ROB_SHEA. So a lot of people reach out to me on Instagram. But I'm happy to answer questions, or if people have tips, suggestions for videos or things they'd like covered. A lot of the information that I have comes from the community. I didn't invent most of this. I'm learning it, and then I'm sharing what I've learned. So kind of giving it back to the community. And so when people will send me corrections and suggestions, and I try to incorporate that into updates to videos and the blog, and just basically trying to put this out there so that hopefully it's easier for the next person than it was for the last person to get involved in infrared photography. That's my goal.
Yes, and Rob also offers one-on-one coaching. If you've got images that you want him to look at and maybe process with you, he does do that as well. So that's all on his website, and you can book a session, and he will do it with you, which is great. Well, thank you so much, Rob. I think it's really quite an eye-opener for a lot of people. And I mean, both technically and creatively, you're amazing. So
thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to stop the